You think you know the story of the Titanic. An unsinkable ship, an iceberg, a tragedy. But what if I told you that this story is just one small part of a much deeper and stranger tale? Forget Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet. You're about to meet the real character from the nightmare of the Olympic-class ships. A woman who didn't just survive the Titanic. She was practically a magnet for maritime disasters. A stewardess who stood on the decks of not one, not two, but all three sister ships as they met their fates. This is the story of Violet Jessop, a woman so unluckily lucky that some sailors refused to travel with her. A woman who saw the Titanic sink, and just 4 years later found herself aboard an even larger ship when it exploded. A woman who was nearly shredded by the propellers of a sinking ship, and survived with a fractured skull she didn't even know she had for years. You're about to hear the shocking tale that history books leave out. This isn't a story of luck, it's the tangled fate of a woman the sea tried to claim 3 times, and failed every time. Before Titanic, there was her big sister, HMS Olympic, the pride of the White Star Line, the largest and most luxurious ship in the world at the time. And on September 20th, 1911, a young stewardess named Violet Jessop was aboard. It was only the Olympic's 5th voyage. Passengers were sipping champagne, enjoying the strength and splendor of the new sea titan. But as the Olympic passed through a narrow channel, something went terribly wrong. HMS Hawke, a British warship designed with one job, to ram and sink other ships, was sailing alongside. Suddenly, to the horror of onlookers, the warship seemed to be pulled by an invisible force and slammed straight into the giant liner's side. The Hawke's reinforced bow, built to tear enemy ships apart, carved 8 feet deep into Olympic's side, slicing a 40-foot gash into the steel hull. 2 watertight compartments flooded instantly. The propeller shaft bent like a twig. To everyone aboard, it felt like crashing into a rock. And yet, it didn't sink. Violet Jessop and the rest made it back to port, shaken but alive. It was a massive loss for the White Star Line, and an ominous sign of things to come. But perhaps the most chilling part? This disaster gave birth to a dangerous lie. Because the Olympic survived, the company used it as proof that these massive ships were unsinkable. A belief with devastating consequences just months later. Everyone knows what happened on April 14th, 1912. But you've never heard it from Violet's point of view. When the White Star Line needed experienced crew for the maiden voyage of their newest, grandest ship, HMS Titanic, they pulled staff from the Olympic. Violet was among them. She was on board when the ship hit the iceberg. In her memoirs, she described the eerie calm at first, where passengers strolled about as if nothing had happened. She was ordered to come up to deck, not to escape, but to set an example, to show non-English-speaking passengers how to behave calmly. But things quickly turned. As the ship tilted and screams erupted, an officer ordered her into Lifeboat 16. Just as she was about to be lowered, someone on deck handed her a bundle. It was a baby, surrounded by the freezing Atlantic and the screams of 1,500 people. Violet held a stranger's child in her arms, watching the unsinkable ship crack and disappear beneath the waves. Here's a detail that will haunt your dreams. Years later, long after retirement, Violet received a strange phone call on a stormy night. A woman's voice asked, "Did you save a baby on the night of the Titanic?" "Yes," Violet replied. The voice laughed and said, "I was that baby," and hung up forever. She had survived the most infamous disaster at sea, but fate wasn't done with her. Not even close. You'd think that after a collision and surviving the Titanic, anyone would choose a career on solid ground. But this is where Violet Jessop's story becomes unbelievably terrifying. During World War I, she served as a nurse with the British Red Cross. Her assignment? The third and final sister ship of the Titanic, HMHS Britannic. It had been converted into a massive floating hospital, painted white with red crosses, supposedly immune from attack. But on November 21st, 1916, while crossing the Aegean Sea, a massive explosion tore through the Britannic. It had struck a German mine. The damage was worse than the Titanic. 6 compartments instantly breached. And then things got worse. As the ship began sinking rapidly, some crew launched lifeboats without orders. But the ship's engines were still running, pulling the boats toward its massive spinning propellers. Violet was in one of those lifeboats. She watched in horror as the lifeboat ahead of her was sucked in, shredded with everyone inside. She knew her boat was next. In her own words, she described it as a mangled mess of men and machinery. There was only one option: jump. She leapt from the lifeboat just as it was destroyed. But as she was pulled under, her head slammed hard against the ship's metal hull. She was rescued from the water alive. The Britannic, the largest ship lost in World War I, sank in just 55 minutes. Once again, Violet Jessop had survived. Years later, while suffering severe headaches, doctors discovered a shocking truth. She had fractured her skull during the disaster and had been living with it ever since. So there you have it. Not the story of a lucky woman, but a human lightning rod for catastrophe. A woman who worked on all 3 Olympic-class ships and was present for all 3 of their disasters. The story they don't teach in school is that Violet Jessop became a legend of the sea, but not always in a good way. Nicknamed Miss Unsinkable, the title was part compliment, part curse. Some superstitious sailors would check the crew list, and if they saw her name, they'd leave the ship. She was a walking ghost of maritime tragedy. She watched a warship slice into her ship, felt the Titanic break apart, and was nearly pulverized by Britannic's propellers. And the most shocking part? She went back to work. Violet served at sea for another 34 years. Finally retiring in 1950, she faced death aboard 3 of the most famous ships in history and chose to spend the rest of her life at sea. Her legacy isn't just survival. It's a masterclass in human courage that borders on the supernatural. If this tangled tale of survival has made you question everything you thought you knew about history, maybe hit that subscribe button, because there are even darker truths deliberately buried in the past. And trust me, you haven't heard anything yet.